In this video, we'll take a look at CometChat and receiving messages. This will include having a regular message received, as well as other messages such as custom messages and media messages, and then we'll move on to having a look at receiving historical messages, such as ones that you might have missed when you're offline, or even just pulling up message history and searching through it. Let's begin. We'll start on the CometChat website and head over to developers and then to documentation. Here, we're going to head over to SDKs and select the JavaScript SDK for web. This time, we're heading over to messaging down over here, and we're going to head to receive messages. We're going to be doing a few things here, but the main ones will be having a look at adding a listener to receive real-time messages in an application while it's running. And the second will be to retrieve missed messages when the application isn't running. So real-time messages are essentially received when an application is running. What happens is that there is a message listener, which we use to capture incoming messages. We do this by using the add message listener method, and this can be found just down here, which we're going to implement very shortly, where we define a listener ID, and then we start capturing messages that are being sent to us. Let's implement this now to see what it'll look like. I have our previous instance of the code that we've written to initialize, set up, and send messages inside of CometChat. If you want to check that out, have a look at the previous video. But after a user has logged in, what I want to do is listen to messages. So I'm going to place in some commands over here. We'll actually place them before we start sending messages so that we can capture and listen to those messages as they come across. I'll start by quickly adding in a note that this section here will be listening to messages as they arrive. In order to complete this section, we're going to need to create a new variable. This variable will be the listener ID. The listener ID is a unique ID, but it's one that we get to define ourselves. We'll define this a little bit later on. The next thing we can do is add the listener itself. To do this, I'm going to call CometChat.addMessageListener, and then I'm going to pass in the listener ID we just created. We then have to define a new class. This class will be the CometChat.messageListener, and this is where we can start to define what events we are listening to. The way this works is that as messages are coming in, we can capture them. We'll start off with a basic text message. Using onTextMessageReceive, we can pull out the text message as a value. Then I'm going to simply console log it out to make it nice and simple for now, but in other situations, you can use this inside of an interaction. So here I'm going to console log out text message has been received successfully and log out the message itself. We can test this out later in console inside of our Chrome test project. Now, the other thing that we can do inside of the CometChat message listener is listen for other types of messages as well. We defined messages as media messages before, so let's actually do that next. Let's pass in onMediaMessageReceived, and here we'll pull out the media message itself as a value, and this value will once again console log out so that we can view it once it arrives. And finally, we'll want to define the custom messages as well. We'll pass in onCustomMessageReceived, and here we'll pull out the custom message and we'll also console log that out. With all that done, we can head back to the top and define a better listener ID. I'm going to create one called incomingMessages_Adrian, and this will be defined a lot better because it's a lot more clear as to its functionality. We're now almost ready to test this out. We can open up our Chrome instance previously where we created a custom message that we can send through this button. The one thing that you'll notice though is that when we do send this message from Adrian to Adrian, we basically aren't getting any kind of received message here. This is because this isn't captured as part of the listener message service. In order for this to work properly, we need to send this from an outside source, such as from another user or another method. So a useful way to be able to do this is to use the REST API, as we haven't implemented full chat functionality with different users just yet. What I'm going to do is show you how to set up the REST API to use for any particular reason. This is useful later when you set up a backend server. Let's head to messages, and here we'll want to head to send a message. First, we'll need to define our URL with an app ID as well as a region. So in this case, my region here is US. Next, we have to define the API call. This is very similar to what we did in JavaScript, where we set up the receiver as well as the receiver type, the type of message, and the message itself. We then need to place in the JSON details. So this is like the JSON application information. And we also send in who the user is, as well as the API key. Now, if you don't have an API key for your REST, you'll need to define one from the dashboard. I'm going to log into my app over here and head to APIs and auth keys and head over to the REST API key. I've already generated one, but if you don't have one, you can generate a brand new one. I'm going to copy this key and I'm going to place this as the very last thing that we need. I did call my user super user when it should be superhero, so I've just updated that, and then I'm going to try this call. And when I perform this call, we see that the data did come through. Superhero has sent Adrian a message here, and let's see if this has come up on our received messages. I'll open up the console and I'll do a refresh, and here we can see that inside of the console we now have a text message has been successfully received. We have all the metadata here as to the message itself, as well as who it's intended for, as well as who it was sent by. And this, in essence, is how the message listening service works. Now that we have a message listener, sometimes we might need to remove it, because as you build an application, you're going to need to build many for different purposes. Let's create a new function inside of our HTML called remove message listener. And in here, we're going to pass in a couple of things. It's just going to be the listener ID, which is the unique ID we created earlier. And this is why the ID is often used in order to reference it later, for example, if you need to remove the message listener. I'll place the incoming underscore messages underscore Adrian as we had previously, and then I'll pass in CometChat.remove message listener and pass in the listener ID. We can call this function anywhere. Sometimes we can even do it automatically. But in this example, I'm just going to add a new button called remove message listener, and this button will activate this function, which will remove the message listener. The goal here is to make sure we're no longer receiving messages to the user here. So I'm going to also console log this out as successful so that we know once it's activated. Let's give this a try. I'll also copy paste this console log command into our add message listener so that we know when it is active. If we open up Chrome now and head over to the developer tools, we should be able to see that the message listener has been successfully added, and there that message is there. And now let's remove it. And now that we've removed it, we can see that's console logged out. And I can head to the REST API and try and send a message from Superhero1 user as a message to myself as Adrian. And we can see that hasn't appeared because the listener is no longer in effect. Let's now take a look at missed messages. We looked at real messages beforehand, but what happens when a user or recipient isn't currently running the application or online? This is where you need to be able to load those missed messages. They come in a variety of types, such as unread messages or message history, or even just missed messages in general. We're going to do this in a couple of ways, but ideally we're going to be using the message request class. This is provided through the message request builder class, and here we'll be doing a couple of functions such as getting the last derived message ID, as well as doing things like fetch next as well as previous. Let's see how this looks inside of VS Code. I'm going to jump into the HTML file, and here I'm going to create a brand new function. This function is going to be the missed messages function, and it's going to pull any messages we might have missed while we're offline. It's also a async function, and we'll find out exactly why that is in a little bit. I'm going to create a button which is going to call this function. This button will just be called a missed messages button, and it'll call the same function for missed messages. Now, to start off with, we need a UID. The UID is the user ID that we're pulling the messages from. We also need a limit. The limit is how many we want to collect as a maximum value. So in this case, I'm setting 30. Lastly, we'll need the latest ID. Now to get this, we're going to call an await function, and this will be await CometChat.get last delivered message ID. This will give us the ID of the last message received from that user. Great, so now we can define a message request. To do this, we're going to create a variable called message request, which is going to call new.CometChat.messageRequestBuilder. The builder is where we define exactly how we want to pull these messages across. So I'll first set the user ID. This is already set with passing in the variable UID, as well as the set message ID, which is the latest ID we defined earlier as well. Finally, we'll set the limit, which is just 30, and we'll build this message request using the message request builder. We can now call it. So let's call message request.fetch next. Then we're going to pull the messages that get pulled out. There are multiple messages here as an array, and we're going to console log them out just to view them for the time being. So I'm going to console log out messages.listFetched, and I'll pass out the messages. Of course, if there are any errors, let's also log those out. So here I'll pull out errors and I'll console log out the message list has failed, and we're going to log out the error as well. Now, in order to test that all of this works, we're going to have to do a few things, because we need to make sure that first we are receiving messages, and then we're going to have to miss a few messages so that we can call this function. There's a trick to this, so what we're going to do is open up Google and head to the debugging. Let's first test to make sure that we are receiving messages by simply calling one from the REST API. We can see that that was delivered successfully. We're going to head over to the network tab and we're going to go in offline mode. This puts Google Chrome in offline state, but it also means that we can't send any messages. So I've pulled up the Edge browser here and I'm going to send a message using the same REST API. If we have a look at the console here, we see that we're not receiving any messages. And this is because we're currently in offline mode. If we go online and select to run the missed messages function, we can see that we've had 2 missed messages from those 2 clicks I did from the REST API. So it looks like this function is working successfully. When we go back online, we can continue to send messages and they're coming through, and the missed messages are coming up as empty now. If, for example, you're trying to get the missed messages from a group rather than just an individual user, simply add a G in front of all the UIDs to create a group ID and update the group ID over here. This will effectively work exactly the same. What's useful is we can use this entire template we've just defined to do a number of things now, such as get the message history. It is essentially the same besides one value which changes. Instead of getting next, we're getting the previous. This way, we're getting the message history of the last 30 messages in a conversation with a user ID. Let's test this out. We'll jump into VS Code, and all I'm going to do is paste in fetch previous here. And this has updated this function from missed messages to message history. Let's actually copy out and paste a brand new one and actually call it that. So I'm going to call this history messages, and I'll create a new button for that as well. I'll update the function called here as well as the text for the button. And here I'll update this to previous. Let's test this out inside of Chrome now. I'm going to refresh and we have a new button here called History Messages. I'm going to open up the console and select to click that, and we can now see the last 30 messages inside of our conversation, which are all the same, but we can see that it is working effectively, and you could use this to load up a message history inside of a UI. The tool for using the message request builder is very powerful. You can even perform searches using it. We'll have a look at defining a keyword and using it to pull out the messages, only including that one keyword. So let's find out how we can do this. What we're going to do over here is search for a specific keyword using a brand new function called search messages. And this I'll also create a new button for. So let's define this just over here and call this search messages. What I want to be able to do here is search for a message with the keyword of hello. So I'm going to define that over here with a search term. I'll call this variable search keyword. And here I'm going to make sure I do a hello as the search term. Then I'm going to add this as part of the request. So in order to do this, I'm going to have to use a new command called set search keyword. In here, I'm just going to pass in the search keyword and we're done. Let's now open up our example here. We'll click search messages, and here, unfortunately, I've only ever used the keyword hello once in my very first message a long time ago where I said hello world. There are a number of other useful features and functions using message history, such as getting the last number of unread message counts for specific users or groups or as a whole. So what we can do here is create a new function called getUnread. We're going to call CometChat.getUnreadMessageCountForUser. And here I'm just going to manually pass in superhero1 as the user, and we want to console log these out. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to pass in then and pull out the array that is part of the response of this message. And then I'll pass in console.log message count, and we'll actually print out this array. Let's also add some error handling in here, and this is a nice succinct function which we can now use. Now I also want to create a button for this, so let me add that above, and we'll just call this unread count. Now it's time to test whether it works or not. Let's open up the console and select to click it, and when we do, we can see that we got our count here. For superhero1, we have 52 unread messages. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This will also be available inside of the documentation, which you can check out in the description below. On top of that, we're going to have a look at filtering messages, and you can find that video just up here. Beautiful.